relationships change the course of our lives, but can they change history?
I'm the Affair Archivist, and this month's affair to remember is that between Consuelo Vanderbilt and Winthrop Rutherford. For her 18th birthday, Consuelo Vanderbilt received a single red rose. As an heiress to one of America's greatest fortunes, surely Consuelo received grander, more extravagant gifts on this day. But the red rose is the one she would always remember, because it was from her beau, Winthrop Rutherford. On that same day, he would propose to her on a bike ride along Riverside Drive. She accepted, yet as they made plans for the future, they were interrupted. Consuelo's mother, Alva, and some of her friends were trailing not too far behind, making sure Winthrop didn't get too close, but it was too late for that. Consuelo was in love and intended to marry Winty. But her mother, who she would later call a born dictator, had other plans for her. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in New York City on March 2, 1877, to William K. Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt. She was an heiress to the Vanderbilt fortune and lived a life of such pristine privilege that even today is hard to imagine. Her mother married into the Vanderbilt shipping and railroad fortune 2 years before. Before Alva became a Vanderbilt, her once prominent Southern family was nearly destitute following the Civil War, and she was determined to restore their good name to comfort and prosperity. After she married William K. in 1875, her father thanked her for reversing the family's fortunes and died 2 weeks later. Alva named her firstborn child after her best friend, Consuelo Iznaga, who would marry into the English aristocracy and eventually become a duchess. Though no one knew the similarities the two Consuelos would eventually have, in hindsight, it's hard not to see this fact as foreshadowing. Alva and William would have 2 sons after Consuelo's birth, William Jr. and Harold. Alva was a social climber that would eventually claw her way to the top of New York society through her iconic ball in 1883, in which she forced Mary Astor to recognize her nouveau riche family. But for Alva, conquering New York City would not be enough. Consuelo would later recollect that her mother subscribed to the authoritarian style of parenting, once telling her as a child, "I don't ask you to think. I do the thinking. You do as you are told." Even more heartwarming, Alva once told Consuelo that she had no taste and that her opinions were not worth listening to. Sounds like a really healthy mother-daughter relationship. Alva's domineering parenting style would seep into every aspect of her daughter's life. She dictated the curriculum of her schooling, which led to Consuelo learning multiple languages. Additionally, she had luncheon with her children every day, which was not the custom of the time for the rich, who did not see their children all that often. Even more smothering, the children slept in Alva's room, yet another breach of the customs of their class, and of overall personal boundaries. Whether Alva did this because she loved her kids so much, or because she wanted to control their lives, is up to interpretation. Perhaps the most extreme action Alva took to ensure her daughter became a perfect lady was by forcing her to wear a steel rod against her back during her schooling. A steel rod ran down my spine and was strapped at my waist and over my shoulders. Another strap went around my forehead to the rod. I probably owe my straight back to many hours of discomfort. Alva did save her daughter from a rogue horse by grabbing its reins and stopping it in its tracks before Consuelo was thrown from the saddle. So, while she may have been controlling, she certainly had a protective streak as well. Like many in the upper tiers of society, Alva participated in charity work and owned a convalescent home for sick and impoverished children. On one occasion, Consuelo met a child from the establishment, her first time seeing how the other half lived. The next day, Consuelo brought supplies and toys to the girl. Later in life, Consuelo's philanthropic streak would truly shine, and she became involved in a variety of causes. As Consuelo grew into a young woman, it was clear that she was a catch. She was beautiful, elegant, well-educated, and filthy rich. However, due to a combination of the times, her class status, and her mother, she would not have much freedom to choose the life she wanted to live. And that was most true when it came to the selection of a suitable husband. Alva made it clear it was she who would select Consuelo's husband, not Consuelo. The heiress reflected in her memoirs. There was in her love of me something of the creative spirit of an artist, that it was her wish to produce me as a finished specimen framed in a perfect setting, and that my person was dedicated to whatever final disposal she had in mind. In the autumn of 1893, a fateful voyage on the Vanderbilts' yacht would change the lives of several of the souls aboard. The Vanderbilts traveled to the Mediterranean and eventually made their way to India, ostensibly to save Alva and William Kay's troubled marriage, though Alva's lover and future husband, Oliver Belmont, tagged along, so you can pretty much guess how well that went. Another noteworthy guest, invited by William Kay, would eventually stir up a fair amount of drama for the Vanderbilts as well. Winthrop Winty Rutherford was one of the leading men of New York society and of Edith Wharton's works. The author called him the prototype of my first novels. He was a descendant of both John Winthrop and Peter Stuyvesant, and was from a wealthy and well-respected family. Like many moneyed men of his generation, Winty was a lawyer, but preferred to spend his time playing polo and golf. Winty was incredibly handsome, tall, and much older than Consuelo. When they met, he was 31, while she was just 17. By the time the travelers made it to India, Alva and William Kay's marriage was over, Consuelo and Winty fell madly in love, and Alva was planting the seeds for her daughter's future, which did not include Winthrop Rutherford. Alva and her husband met with the Governor-General of India, Lord Lansdowne. She was enchanted by the splendor they lived in and the relative freedom of the Lord's wife, who was involved in charity work. Alva was attracted to the fact that women of British society were not meant to be holed up in a parlor room drinking tea and throwing parties. They became involved in charity and played active roles in their own lives and society. Consuelo later wrote, "My mother, whose habit it was to impose her views rather than to invite discussion, had already, on occasion, revealed her admiration for the British way of life, and her desire to place me in an aristocratic setting. These intentions, I am sure, crystallized during her visit at Government House." Interestingly, Alva would find out that Lady Lansdowne had a nephew who had a title, the Duke of Marlborough, or more accurately, Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, Marquess of Blandford, Earl of Sunderland, Earl of Marlborough, Baron Spencer of Wormleighton, Baron Churchill of Sandridge, Prince of the Holy Roman Empire. A mere knickerbocker wasn't going to do it for Alva. She wanted her daughter to marry into royalty. After returning from India in 1894, Consuelo made her debut in Paris and charmed the city with her beauty, elegance, and intelligence. She received 5 marriage proposals, but her mother turned down all but one. Prince Francis Joseph, a member of German royalty, was briefly considered. It's mysterious as to why this one suitor was a cut above the rest. Maybe because his name started with Prince? After Paris, Consuelo made her debut in London. An entry point into English society was Alva's goal. By now, the Dollar Princess phenomenon was well underway. Towards the end of the 19th century, the British aristocracy was in serious need of a cash infusion. Their archaic estates were crumbling, and given that they made their income from grain that was now being more cheaply harvested in the United States, they did not have the money to enjoy the same luxurious lifestyle that their ancestors did. Yet, they discovered a loophole. They can marry rich Americans, collect a huge dowry, renovate their estates, and live the good life. American heiresses, such as Alva's old friend Consuelo Yznaga and Jenny Jerome, had already married into titles in exchange for a sizable dowry. If all went according to plan, Consuelo would carry on the Dollar Princess tradition into a new generation and catch a bigger fish than any American woman before her. Alva called upon Lady Minnie Paget to help Consuelo nab the Duke of Marlborough. An American Dollar Princess herself, Lady Paget ran something of a dating service for rich Americans and English aristocrats, and did not mince words when giving Consuelo advice. She was told that the shape of her nose was not up to snuff. Consuelo was also advised to buy finer clothes, since she would be competing for the Duke's affections amongst girls much prettier than her. Consuelo took Lady Paget's scathing advice, and the socialite arranged for a dinner party in which both Consuelo and the Duke would be present. Consuelo wrote about her first impressions of the Duke. "He seemed to me very young, although 6 years my senior, and I thought him good-looking and intelligent. He had a small aristocratic face, with a large nose and rather prominent blue eyes. His hands, which he used in a fastidious manner, were well-shaped, and he seemed inordinately proud of them. Inordinately proud was a good way to describe the ninth Duke of Marlborough's personality as a whole. Though he was called Sonny, this nickname came about from his childhood title and had no bearing on his actual personality, which was anything but. A true believer in the English peerage system, the Duke fulfilled just about every stereotype you could imagine about an English aristocrat of his time. As one historian put it, he was surly, critical, suspicious, and without intellectual qualities. Nonetheless, the Duke's family ranked ninth in all of the British peerage system. Despite a £40,000 a year salary from the English government, about $6.5 million today, the family is forced to sell priceless family heirlooms and paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Van Dyck to keep themselves afloat. Sonny was determined to restore his family to their former glory and was in want of a rich wife. Following her London debut, Alva and Consuelo made their way back to America. Alva had 3 goals in mind on that voyage: getting a divorce, pursuing a relationship with Oliver Belmont, and marrying her daughter off to the Duke of Marlborough. Though she charmed European society that season, Consuelo's heart lay with a fellow New Yorker. As they sped away from Alva and her cronies on their bikes on Consuelo's birthday, Winty stole just enough time to propose marriage. Consuelo accepted, and he promised to follow her to Europe, as she was making the crossing for the 1895 season within just a few weeks. Winty told Consuelo that he would follow me, but I must not tell my mother, since she would most certainly withhold her consent to our engagement. On my return to America, we might plan an elopement. Winty was correct that Alva would never allow her daughter to marry him. Though he was considered an American aristocrat, this was not good enough for Alva. She wanted her daughter to have a real title, and the only way to achieve that would be to marry a true blue-blood European. Alva would claim later that she insisted on this because she wanted her daughter to be of use to society. If she married a moneyed American, perhaps she would live the same vapid existence that Alva perceived herself as carrying out. Winty personified the languid first class of America at the time. As Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. remarked, the Rutherfords lived well, dressed expensively, and did little else. It's also important to note that Alva and William K. divorced in 1895, just as Consuelo was coming out in society and falling in love with Winty. Perhaps Winty reminded Alva of her freshly ex-husband, who was also rich, lived well, and did little else. Perhaps her resentment of the New York 400, who had branded her nouveau riche 2 decades before and turned their noses up at her and her wealth, influenced her to find her daughter a husband outside of this ironclad circle. Or maybe she really wanted to stick it to the Knickerbockers who once shunned her with one final trump card, a duchess for a daughter. Perhaps Alva was sincere in her desire to see Consuelo transcend the expectations of American women of her time, and to take a more active role in society the way British women did. It also goes without saying that at this time, divorce was absolutely frowned upon, especially for a woman of Alva's class. The ripple effects of her divorce did little to impact her husband's standing in society. However, because of the sexism of the time, Alva once again found herself to be a pariah of New York society. Rather than trying to once again outdo the 400, perhaps Alva was trying to make a prestigious marriage for Consuelo in an attempt to force her way back into the club. While her true intentions are hard to pin down, it is likely that a combination of all of these factors guided Alva in what she did next. When Alva and Consuelo arrived in Europe, Consuelo was confined to her room like a prisoner, and all of her letters to her fiancé never made their way to him. She received no news from Winty and fell into a depression. It seems that his letters got lost in the mail. I wonder how that happened. Consuelo would later find out that Winty did as promised and followed her to Paris, but it was of course Alva who kept them apart and destroyed all of his letters to her daughter. Maybe Alva served as inspiration for the notebook. Though she was heartbroken, Consuelo still managed to make an impression on the Duke of Marlborough. They reunited at a ball, and the Duke asked Consuelo to dance twice. Even more encouraging for Alva, they were invited to Blenheim Palace. Consuelo believes it was on this visit that the Duke decided he would marry her. He planned to go into politics and felt that Consuelo had the right combination of elegance, intelligence, and money to make a suitable wife for the Duke. Shortly after her visit, Alva sent the Duke an invitation to a ball at her mansion in Newport, Marble House, that August. Sonny accepted, and Alva was elated and was assured that her plan was coming to fruition. As they made their way back to the States, Consuelo felt that she was being steered into a vortex that would engulf me. Consuelo Vanderbilt had never stood up to her mother before. She knew better than to try. In the past, perhaps Consuelo thought it was not worth the energy to put up a fight with her mother. But this time was different. She was in love, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to wrest control of her life from her mother's hands. As Consuelo contemplated how she would confront her mother, Alva was already weaponizing her daughter's prospective marriage to the Duke in New York society. They believed that the Duke would not consider Consuelo as a prospect given her parents' divorce. Alva was happy to inform them that he was actually most definitely considering Consuelo, and he was attending her ball the following month. And just like that, Alva regained her previous social standing and recovered from the damage the divorce did to her reputation. Clearly, Alva had a vested interest in ensuring that this marriage did not fall through. Consuelo, however, was about to put all of her hard-laid plans into peril. She wanted to marry Winty. She later wrote, "It would, I knew, entail a struggle, but I meant to force the issue with my mother." Perhaps Alva could sense that her daughter was not as keen on becoming the Duke's wife as she was. Upon their return to Newport, Consuelo was once again relegated to a gilded cage. She was a prisoner, with my mother and governess as wardens. It took some time for Consuelo to muster up the courage to confront her mother. She was finally inspired to take a stand when she saw Winty again at a ball that summer. They had one fleeting yet tender dance, which was of course interrupted by Alva. Before they were torn apart, Winty assured Consuelo that his feelings for her had not changed. This finally emboldened her to tell her mother she did not intend to marry the Duke. That's right, Consuelo had the absolute audacity to tell Alva that she should be allowed to marry a man of her own choosing. The gall. Alva didn't take the news well. These words, the bravest I had ever uttered, brought down a frightful storm of protest. I suffered every searing reproach, heard every possible invective hurled at the man I loved. I was informed of his numerous flirtations, of his well-known love for a married woman, of his desire to marry an heiress. Alva also claimed that insanity ran in his family, and that she would not be able to have children if she married him. Winty would eventually sire 7 children, so this was clearly either a vicious rumor or a nasty figment of Alva's harried imagination. Alva also insisted that Consuelo was too young to choose her own husband, but not too young to get married to an English aristocrat of her mother's choosing and leave behind her country and all she had ever known, apparently. Not content with plain character assassination, Alva threatened to actually kill the man Consuelo loved. Consuelo recalled years later that her mother said she would not hesitate to shoot a man whom she considered would ruin my life. The morning after their row, Marble House was quiet. Too quiet. Consuelo knew something was amiss. Though Alva did not appear, her friend, Mrs. J., informed Consuelo that her mother had taken ill. In fact, she informed Consuelo that Alva had suffered a heart attack as a result of her daughter's callous indifference to her feelings. Mrs. J. reiterated Alva's threat from the night before. Though she was supposedly recovering from a heart attack, that wouldn't stop her from murdering Winty. Consuelo asked her if there was any way her mother could be convinced, to which Mrs. J. replied, "Your mother will never relent, and I warn you, there will be a catastrophe if you persist. The doctor has said that another scene may easily bring on a heart attack, and he will not be responsible for the result. You can ask the doctor yourself if you do not believe me." After threatening to kill her lover, then claiming that she herself would die if she married Winty, Alva got what she wanted. Consuelo felt powerless against the iron will of her mother. In utter misery, I asked Mrs. J. to let Mr. Rutherford know that I could not marry him. Apparently successfully forcing your daughter to marry a duke she doesn't love is the cure for heart ailments, because after this moment, Alva miraculously recovered. No stents or bypass required. Amazing. Following this soul-crushing episode, Consuelo was trapped in Marble House in misery. She contemplated getting her father involved to vouch for her, but quickly realized it would be futile. That would only involve him in a hopeless struggle against impossible odds and further stimulate my mother's rancor. Considering their messy divorce, Consuelo's instincts on this one were most likely correct. Even more disturbingly, her father may not have been on her side had she gone to him for help anyway. During the Duke's trip to Newport, which would soon take place, William K. met with the Duke for luncheon, which suggests that he also wanted Consuelo to marry for a title, not love. Though he didn't need the same reputation boost as Alva following their divorce, it is likely that the idea of his daughter becoming a duchess and catapulting the status of the Vanderbilt name ever higher appealed to him as well. The only person Consuelo could turn to was her English governess, Miss Harper, who was able to put a somewhat positive spin on this heartbreaking situation. How wisely she spoke of the future awaiting me in her country, of the opportunities for usefulness and social service I would find there, of the happiness a life lived for others can bring. And in such gentle appeals to my better nature, she slowly swung me from a contemplate of a purely personal nature to a higher idealism. Only time would tell if this higher idealism was worth a loveless marriage. As for Winty, he did not attempt to run away with Consuelo or plan a secret elopement. After receiving her letter, he backed off and spent the rest of the summer in Newport, putting his sorrows away on the golf course. Just as Consuelo's dreams of marrying Winthrop Rutherford died, Alva's dream of Consuelo marrying the 9th Duke of Marlborough was very close to being realized. As promised, the Duke arrived in Newport in August of 1895, and Alva put out all the stops to make him feel welcome. She threw a ball clearly designed to enchant the Duke. The New York Herald reported, "Lotus flowers and water hyacinths filled with tiny globes of light floated in a fountain in the hall. On every table there were orchids, ferns, and pink hollyhocks tied with illuminated pink ribbons. Tiny hummingbirds swarmed amid the flowers." The papers considered it an even bigger success than Alva's famous 1883 ball that revolutionized New York society. Alva called it the perfect night. As the Duke's visit wore on, speculation grew regarding the seemingly imminent engagement between him and Consuelo. As the summer ended and autumn loomed, Alva decided she needed to apply pressure on Sonny, as he was scheduled to leave the U.S. in mid to late September. She did this by going to the press and insisting that the Duke and her daughter were not engaged, which was published in the Newport Daily News on Wednesday, September 18th. Taking the hint that evening, the Duke asked Consuelo to marry him in the Gothic room at Marble House, a setting that Consuelo said was propitious to sacrifice. She accepted his proposal. The engagement was announced on September 20th, 1895. The press called it a famous victory and a short but decisive campaign of General Alva. Consuelo's little brother Harold, then 12 years old, told her the Duke was only marrying her for her money. This insult added to injury caused Consuelo to burst into tears. After the engagement was announced, the cynical work of arranging the marriage settlement commenced. The deal, which almost fell through, was in the end ironically brokered by Consuelo, as her parents and Sonny struggled to come to an agreement. The Duke made out very well. He received $2.5 million in Vanderbilt stock, amounting to nearly $100 million today, plus 4% interest a year, which totaled to an annual income of about $100,000 in 1895. This sum is worth $3.7 million today. The Duke would be able to restore Blenheim Palace to its former glory, and then some. This sum was guaranteed for life, even in the event that he and Consuelo divorced. Consuelo didn't make out too badly either. Her father agreed to pay her $100,000 a year as well, perhaps as compensation for her sacrifice. It wasn't much consolation, though. After the agreement was finalized, servants claimed that Consuelo cried all night. In the 1890s, the press was just discovering that reporting on the exploits and scandals of the very rich was great for selling newspapers. Though it was clear that Sonny and Consuelo were not a love match, the press still pounced on any clues that the Duke was marrying the Vanderbilt heiress for her money. He was heavily criticized in the New York press for stating that his marriage was arranged by his friends and those of Miss Vanderbilt. The papers also ridiculed the height discrepancy between the Duke and Consuelo. He was 5'2", she was 5'8", a fact that would later be emphasized in John Singer Sargent's portrait of the Spencer Churchill family. The Duke made another PR blunder when he refused to pay duties on engagement gifts for Consuelo sent from England by his family. The press made him out to be miserly and selfish, and it further fueled the speculation that the Duke only married Consuelo for her money, which was of course true. As the wedding planning was underway, Alva made most of the important decisions. Consuelo's dress was made by Alva's dressmaker and incorporated lace that Alva wore on her own wedding day. Consuelo later recalled that her mother did not trouble to consult the taste she claimed I did not possess. The New York Herald reported, "The bridal corset is made of white satin brocaded with tiny white carnations and trimmed at the upper edge with a deep pointed border of Valenciennes lace. The clasps, the large hook, and the buckles on the attached stocking supporter are all of solid gold." How did the press obtain such painstaking details? Most likely it was Alva. She gave permission to Vogue to publish details about Consuelo's bridal lingerie, sketches of which were published in the magazine. Consuelo was mortified that the whole world knew what she would be wearing under her wedding dress. Alva selected most of the bridesmaids, several of whom were her own friends and significantly older than her daughter. Consuelo's months spent in isolation resulted in her friends no longer calling on her, adding even more sadness to an already depressing wedding day. On November 6, 1895, 5,000 people lined the streets surrounding St. Thomas Church in Manhattan, hoping to catch a glimpse of the heiress and soon-to-be Duchess in her much-hyped wedding dress. The wedding day had originally been set for November 5th. However, the Duke refused to be married on Guy Fawkes Day. Consuelo spent the morning of her wedding day crying uncontrollably, isolated and under surveillance in a room that not even her governess was permitted to enter. As she headed towards the church in her bridal carriage, hundreds of women ran alongside, hoping to steal a fleeting glance of the American Duchess. During the ceremony, Consuelo tried to make eye contact with Sonny, but he was staring into the abyss. The Duke later recalled that his bride looked much troubled. The New York Herald reported, "She looked sad and appeared to have been crying, a natural proceeding with brides. Nevertheless, she went through with it and became the Duchess of Marlborough." Consuelo was one of 9 moneyed brides that married into the landed gentry that year. Following a whirlwind day of tears, crowds, and the reception, Consuelo departed New York City with her husband. As the bridal carriage moved further and further away from her New York City home, Consuelo took one final look back. My mother was in the window. She was hiding behind the curtain, yet I saw that she was in tears. And yet, I thought, she has attained the goal she set herself. She has experienced the satisfactions wealth can confer. She has ensconced me in the niche she so early assigned me, and she is now free to let ambition give way to a gentler passion. But, as we know, gentler passions weren't really Alva's thing. Consuelo and Sonny soon departed for their honeymoon, part of which was spent at Idlehour, the Vanderbilts' Long Island estate, the other in Europe. In her memoirs, Consuelo emphasizes the gloom that hung over the honeymoon, of how the cold weather rattled her bones, and how her even colder husband left her feeling depressed and alone. The gravity of her situation had just sunk in. A sudden realization of my complete innocence assailed me, bringing with it fear. Like a deserted child, I longed for my family. The problem created by the marriage of 2 irreconcilable characters is a psychological one which deserves sympathy as well as understanding. In the hidden reaches where memory probes are sorrows too deep to fathom. On the voyage to Spain, Sonny was seasick and Consuelo was struggling with her new lot in life. They began to argue, and Consuelo told Sonny that she had jilted the man she loved to marry him. Sonny countered that he too had a lover that he had to break things off with in order to restore Blenheim. When the couple moved on to Italy, Consuelo fell ill in Rome, and an Italian doctor told her that she only had a year to live. A specialist was summoned, who assured her that she would live beyond a year, that she simply outgrew her strength. While his wife convalesced, Sonny went on a shopping spree with his newfound wealth, mainly with the intention of replacing the Spencer Churchill heirloom sold off to cover his father's debts. The Duke admitted he was glad that his wife was too sick to join him, since shopkeepers would drive up the prices as soon as they took a look at the Duchess in her fur coat. After several months on their drab honeymoon, the couple arrived at Blenheim Palace to a warm welcome from the townspeople, their subjects. Consuelo was given flowers and felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities that being a duchess would entail. As they arrived at Blenheim, she also realized she would not enjoy the same comforts she did in her mother's carefully designed mansions in New York and Newport. While the palace had 40 servants and 170 rooms, it had just one bathroom. We slept in small rooms with high ceilings. We dined in dark rooms with high ceilings. We dressed in closets without ventilation. Shortly after her arrival at her new home, Consuelo was lectured by the Duke about her position as the new Duchess of Marlborough. He referred to her as a link in the chain, which offended Consuelo at first. It was clear that he only chose her as his wife for her money. Then he insinuates that her only role in life is to provide him with an heir. However, with hindsight, Consuelo realized he was referring to the tradition his children would be born into. He meant that there were certain standards that must be maintained, whatever the cost, for what was a generation but such a link. And to him it was inconceivable that he, given the greatness of his position, should fail to uphold the tradition of his class. Early on in their marriage, it was clear that Consuelo and Sonny were two very different people. Consuelo was turned off by how her husband often acted like a villainous Downton Abbey character. He once hid away a small china box to see if anyone noticed. One of the maids was distraught, believing she had been framed for theft. Consuelo had to comfort her and assure her everything was all right. At dinner each night, the Duke and Duchess had very little conversation. Consuelo just sat there and watched her husband play with his rings for an hour. Despite these challenges, Consuelo adapted to her new country and her new role with relative ease. As Alva hoped, she found a purpose in public service, reading to elderly women and making visits to other villagers. They all loved her and believed she genuinely cared for their well-being. In 1897, she gave birth to a son, Blandford, thus securing an heir for the Marlborough dynasty. Their second son and spare, Ivor, was born a year later. Thus Consuelo had done her duty by adding new links to the chain. Consuelo was popular amongst the English upper crust as well, though she was occasionally the subject of some snobby comments. When she wore a crescent instead of a tiara to a gathering with the Queen, another aristocrat scolded her. She defended herself by informing him that she did not have time to retrieve her tiara from the bank beforehand, as she was busy at a charity event. For the coronation of Edward VII, Consuelo was asked to be a canopy bearer for Queen Alexandra. This was a huge honor and validated Consuelo's place in high society. Nonetheless, by the early 1900s, it was clear that the Duke and Consuelo had some serious irreconcilable differences. The Duke had a similar need for domination and control to Alva, which Consuelo found hard to live with. Their political views differed. The Duke was a Tory, while Consuelo believed it was the rich's duty to help the poor. When Consuelo donated funds to the townspeople to have a road repaired, they sent a thank you note to the Duke, who became very angry at her. Despite having all the money in the world, and it being his literal responsibility to take care of his subjects, he was angry that Consuelo did this without his consent. History repeated itself when Consuelo found herself once again confined to an incredibly fancy mansion with very little to do and barely anyone to speak to. She took long walks around the palace and imagined what life was like for the past residents of her home. Alva bought her a car to alleviate her boredom. The Duke was often away in London trying to develop a political career for himself, which would prove unsuccessful. As their unhappy marriage approached its 10th year, both the Duke and Duchess began to have wandering eyes. The Duke became infatuated with another American socialite, Gladys Deacon, and sent her many lovesick letters. Consuelo may have had an affair with French painter Paul César Helleu, who painted 2 portraits and a few sketches of Consuelo between 1900 and 1901. The end came in 1906, when Consuelo fell in love with the Duke's cousin, Viscount Castlereagh. He was a foil for the Duke, tall, handsome, compassionate, and with a political career on the upswing. The Viscount and Consuelo violated one of the cardinal rules of Edwardian society. If you were going to have an affair, you'd better be secretive and discreet about it. The lovers were not shy about expressing their love, and either planned to run off to Paris together or actually did so. It is unclear which is true. Coming to her senses, Consuelo ended the affair and returned to Blenheim. A scandal was brewing for Consuelo, and the consequences were potentially dire. Consuelo stood to lose her title, her reputation, and her children if Sonny went public with the affair and pursued a divorce. Luckily for her, she had befriended the Duke's cousin, Winston Churchill, maybe you've heard of him, who vouched for her and arranged a separation agreement with the Duke. William K. also came to his daughter's aid at long last to ensure that her good name was not sullied by this indiscretion. The terms of separation were finally agreed to. Neither party would accuse the other of infidelity, and the children would spend 6 months with their father and 6 months with their mother. Consuelo was lucky that a larger scandal did not erupt as a result of her love affair. Neither her reputation nor the Duke's suffered any significant impact as a result of the separation. However, the King and Queen condemned the Duke and Duchess for being so messy. This period marked a crossroads in Consuelo's life. She couldn't see other men since she was not officially divorced, and any romances could be used as leverage against her by the Duke to deprive her of her children. She only had her sons 6 months of the year. She moved to London, and one friend said, "Her loneliness now tore my heart. She had everything in the world except the things that matter most. After she kissed me farewell, I hated to hear those little heels of hers clicking away from me across the marble floors into the dim desolation of that great French palace, fragrant with lilies and incense, and lovely with antique brooches and priceless porcelain." However, this loneliness also brought her freedom. Consuelo was finally free to be an independent woman, like her mother wanted her to be. She continued working on behalf of the poor, unmarried mothers, and children in London. She also became active in the fight for women's suffrage, both in England and in her home country, and she retained the title of Duchess. This arrangement would last nearly 15 years until Consuelo and Sonny divorced on the grounds of abandonment in 1920. Shortly thereafter, Consuelo was remarried to French aviator Jacques Balsan. Interestingly, Consuelo met Balsan decades before, when she made her debut in Paris in 1894. As soon as the Frenchman saw the American heiress, he was infatuated. He went home that night and told his mother that he would marry her one day. Unfortunately for Jacques, though he came from a well-off family, he did not have the aristocratic pedigree that Alva was seeking for her daughter, so he had to wait about a quarter century. The couple had a long and happy marriage that ended only with Balsan's death in 1956. For Winty, he remained alone for 7 years following the end of his doomed romance with Consuelo. He married Alice Morton, the daughter of a wealthy banker, and had 6 children with her. They were happily married until her death in 1917. 3 years later, he married Lucy Mercer, former secretary of Eleanor Roosevelt and former lover of Eleanor's husband. They had 1 child together and remained happily married until Winty's death in 1944. Though, like her husband, Lucy also had one great long-lost love, who also happened to be President of the United States. If you'd like to learn more about this affair, watch my video, The Unfinished Portrait, linked above. After Consuelo and the Duke's divorce in the 1920s, a reporter asked Winty about Consuelo. "Yes, some 30 years ago I knew Miss Vanderbilt, and I was one of her great admirers," he wistfully replied. According to Alva, despite everything, her daughter was glad that she married an Englishman. However, we're not so sure how Consuelo herself felt about it. She was rather tight-lipped about any potential regrets or misgivings she may have had about her life in her memoir. After all, it worked out in the end. She found true love and lived happily with the man of her dreams for decades. On top of that, she found meaning in altruistic endeavors, which she continued to be actively involved in up until the end of her life. She also lived a relatively independent life, especially for a woman of her time and class, and was a well-respected member of European and American society. Could it be that Alva's insistence that her daughter marry an English aristocrat turned out to be an indirect way of turning her daughter into a feminist? At the end of Winty's life, his obituary noted that he was an owner of fox terrier kennels around the country. Would Consuelo have been content to live a life of mundane luxury that Winty preferred? Would she have become bored and restless had she not become a duchess? We will never know, but nonetheless, Consuelo's life was well lived despite this heartbreak. However, it is undeniable that Consuelo paid a hefty price for marrying the Duke, and I'm not just talking about her dowry. She was unhappy for years, trapped in a loveless marriage to a cold man. and had huge expectations placed upon her shoulders. Though she faced these challenges with grace and grit, she had to fight for years to take control of her destiny. For anyone in her position, it would be difficult not to think of how life would have been had the circumstances been different. In the aftermath of their dissolved romance, the New York World wrote of Winty and Consuelo's broken bond. This joyousness must now be relegated to the saddest of might-have-beens. It seems, amongst all of her duties as a duchess, her many charitable endeavors, her fight for women's suffrage, and her second devoted marriage, Consuelo never forgot her first love. Following her death in December of 1964, a photograph of a young man was found amongst her personal effects. It was Winthrop Rutherford, her greatest might-have-been. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and join me next time as we delve into another affair from history.